Opening the door for the king's bishop, this knight maneuver subtly prepares for kingside expansion while contesting central influence. Immediately contesting the center establishes an active presence, aiming to challenge white's initial pawn advances and dictate the early pawn structure. Establishing central pawn presence solidifies piece activity and offers multiple avenues for future development. Developing the knight harmoniously, this knight now eyes central squares and supports potential pawn advances. Challenging black's central dominance, this pawn push immediately introduces dynamic possibilities and questions control over key squares. Solidifying the center, this pawn advances to shore up the knight and prepare for a potential e6 push, creating a firm Slav-like structure. Solidifying the center's pawn structure and developing another knight harmoniously, preparing for a potential queenside expansion or central break. Preparing b5 to challenge white's queenside space occupation and hinder immediate c5. Opening the diagonal for the queen and aiming to disrupt black's central pawn structure. Exposing your knight to immediate recapture creates a tactical risk, potentially weakening your central structure for minimal long-term gain. Challenging black's knight, this pawn thrust aggressively gains space and aims to disrupt the kingside. Capturing the knight opens lines for your queen and king, potentially weakening white's central control. Opening the h-file now creates immediate attacking prospects against black's pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn center with a pawn shield, this move subtly weakens the dark squares around the king. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the queen's bishop, while keeping the king's side safe for now. Developing the bishop here neatly connects the rooks and prepares to castle, while subtly influencing the kingside diagonals. Establishing knight dominance in the center, this knight now targets crucial squares and restricts black's piece mobility. Securing the king now allows for future pawn advances on the kingside without immediate exposure. Unleashing the queen aims to pressure the king's side and potentially break open lines towards the beleaguered monarch. Unleashing pawns to challenge the center, black ignites a fierce pawn storm, aiming to dismantle white's central setup. Opening the g-file creates immediate pressure against black's king, forcing a potentially weakened pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn opens lines, but exposes your king's safety to white's attacking pieces. Knight repositioning to a more central outpost, ready to influence queenside play and threaten weaknesses. Liberating the queenside pawn allows development and prepares to challenge the center with c5. Targeting the d4 square with the knight opens lines and pressures black's pawn structure. Securing the central pawn and creating a queenside pawn chain aims to achieve queenside space and counter white's central ambitions. Asserting control of the queenside with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and gain space. Launching a swift counterattack along the queenside diagonal, black seeks to exploit white's overextended pawn and potentially disrupt white's development. Securing the rook on a more active diagonal aims to exploit potential weaknesses along the a-file, while also preparing for future central advances. Black seeks to seize the initiative by kicking white's knight and disrupting their pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines toward the black king and offers a tactical advantage. A prudent retreat, prioritizing the king's safety after the active pawn grab. Targeting the weak pawn on c4 creates immediate dynamic pressure, forcing black to react while consolidating white's central space advantage. Boldly reorienting the queen to engage the kingside opens up dynamic counterplay. This knight hops into a central outpost, pressuring the pawn and king's diagonal. Sacrificing the queen like this opens up critical lines of attack towards your king. Unveiling a doubled pawn, white aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure while opening the g-file for potential aggression. Embracing the open, a file, black seeks active counterplay on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Seizing the open d-file with the knight forces an immediate response and opens avenues for further penetration. Activating the bishop to a more dynamic square, This aims to improve piece coordination and pressure white's queenside. Unleashing the bishop to control the crucial diagonal. This move sharpens white's central control and pressures black's queenside. Securing that rook on the 7th rank establishes a formidable defensive cordon, eyeing potential weaknesses. Gaining control of the file with the rook solidifies white's pressure on the queenside. Challenging the knight's occupation of the d6 outpost, aiming to disrupt white's central presence. Clearing the way for the other bishop to join the attack, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside. Repositioning the rook to the d-file offers vital support and opens avenues for counterplay against white's isolated pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop opens a clear path for the rooks to invade, seeking to disrupt black's pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, disrupting white's pawn structure and eyeing the queenside. Repositioning the knight to c4 aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare for further infiltrations. Challenging the queenside pawn structure opens lines for your rook and potentially creates an outpost for your knight. Introducing a central pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially open the d-file for future pressure. Seizing the open file, black aims to activate the rook and disrupt white's centralized knight. Snatching the pawn aims to exploit the exposed black king, though it temporarily weakens white's queenside pawn structure. Opening the f-file aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially creating a weakness for black's rook. A king's journey to safety, finally embracing the scant defense offered by his pawns. Embracing the open files, this captures a pawn and injects chaos into white's king's safety. Embracing the open f-file, white aims to reactivate kingside forces despite accepting pawn structural concessions. Launching pawns forward like this creates crucial space for black's pieces to breathe and potentially attack. Liberating the d-file for rook activity, this challenges black's pawn structure and opens avenues for aggressive play. Reclaiming the central file is paramount, opening avenues for rook activity and challenging white's control. Liberating the d-file opens lines for your rooks and aims to break black's central pawn blockade. Clearing the central tension, this exchange aims to simplify the position and activate the rook. A daring knight maneuver aims to exploit the weakened central pawn structure and create attacking opportunities on the kingside. Unlocking the bishop's potential becomes paramount now, aiming to improve its scope before the exchange clears the center. Opening the f-file offers a temporary pawn majority, but neglects the e-pawn's precariousness and the potential for king's safety issues. The rook repositions, preparing to contest the open file and potentially infiltrate white's weakened queenside. Repositioning the knight to e5 prepares a decisive infiltration, eyeing weaknesses around black's king. Repositioning the rook to a more active file for potential breakthroughs or defensive reinforcement. Unlocking the f-file offers a chance to activate your rook and threaten further breakthroughs, vital for this precarious endgame. The pawn structure crumbles, opening lines towards the exposed kingside for a fierce endgame assault. Sacrificing the rook opens a path to the enemy king, transforming the position into a sudden, sharp attack. Relocating the king to the relative safety of g8 forestalls immediate threats and prepares for a potential defense on the kingside. Seizing the open file, this capture strategically isolates black's king and cracks open the center for white's remaining pieces. Liberating black's bishop opens the critical e-file, aiming to activate the rook and potentially disrupt white's doubled pawns. Recapturing the rook simplifies the position and forces a clear endgame path. Shifting the king opens a pathway for piece regrouping, aiming to consolidate the vulnerable d-pawn. Probing the king's safety, this rook repositioning aims to exploit open files and initiate an endgame attack. Solidifying the king's escape route, this quiet repositioning prepares for the pawn race ahead. Activating the king into the center is crucial for endgame battles, eyeing key squares. Navigating towards safety, the black monarch seeks refuge from the open files, aiming to consolidate its position. King activation is paramount now, seeking central influence and support for potential pawn advances.